Welcome to Tap for Green, a podcast for Commander players by Commander players.
With an emphasis on saving you green.
My name is Ernest.
And I'm Akash. This time we're here to break down actual gameplay stats of the new C19 decks played straight out of the box with no upgrades.
So you can see here what we measured. We looked at card draw and ramp, two key components in any deck. Then we looked at more subjective stats, like how long does it take a player to get its engine going or set up, or how long does it take to recover from a board wipe.
Right, so basically we took a dive into statistics, but we did have a few caveats. This was not a scientific study. We're not statisticians. We did not allow for control variables as you would in any science experiment. For example, we allowed our play group to swap commanders, meaning sometimes we play with a face commander or one of the alternates. In theory, Wizards of the Coast provides these alternates so you can play with them out of the box. Obviously, some may work better than others. But also, quite frankly, it made the play experience more fun and more diverse for us grinding out games. Another caveat is when we show you the graphs, the y-axis will measure different things. So what Ernest was talking about earlier with setup, those would be number of turns. You'd want that to be obviously as low as possible. You want to set up as quickly as you can. With card draw, you want that as high as possible. You want to draw as many cards as you possibly can. So the y-axis will measure different things, maybe number of turns, maybe number of cards drawn. And depending on what that thing is, the greater or least number might be the actual optimal. And also, we're dealing with a limited sample size.
Right. The whole idea is to give the audience a feel on how these decks, play, but backed up by some numbers. We should mention that every number that we show you is an average of games played, usually 4 to 5 per deck, with the exception of wins, of course.
So our first deck we're going to talk about is Faceless Menace, the Sultai Morph deck, and my personal favorite. I should mention we never actually used any of the alternate commanders on this deck. We did play with them during the game, but we never used them as a commander. Ernest, what do you think about this one?
Honestly, I honestly didn't know what to expect when I first picked this deck up, because I thought like morphs. I haven't played with morphs since Cons of Tarkir, and I know morph is a very old mechanic going back to the day, but it played very well. It was honestly, it blew my expectations out of the water. I mean, casting morphs for free was fun, drawing cards from those morphs, and yeah, the deck was just pretty solid all around. Would it be good for a new player? I'm not sure, but for a player that's been around for a while, it's great.
No, I totally agree with those thoughts. I thought it played well. It was a unique concept. You can see morphs in EDH outside of Animar decks, and so this is kind of nice to see it in Sultai. And even then, it's hard to, you don't see many Animar decks in the wild. So let's go over the results. This was our most winning deck, albeit by a single game. The thing that surprised me was lack of reactivity. The advantage of morphs is you play at instant speed, but what we found was while we did things on people's end steps, we necessarily did not react to people doing things. Of course, unless it's Willbender, and it's always Willbender.
Yeah, the number of times of casting your commander, most of the time we cast probably about 3 times per game, and the recovery rate for this deck was a little low just because if you didn't have any morphs in hand to get going, you were kind of stuck until you got those, card draw, cards to help you refill my hand really quick, because that's what hurt this deck the most, I believe.
Yep, totally agree. So next up, we're going to talk about Primal Genesis, the Naya Populate deck. So what'd you think about this one?
Honestly, I loved it. I loved it right out of the box. It was simple, easy to use. Any EDH player that's new to the format can pick this up and and just have a great time with it. It has a lot of great cards in it. They reprinted and some new ones. But overall, token making's always fun. And just make tokens, smash face, bam. You got what you need right out of the box.
No, I totally agree with most of what you said. I mean, it ran so simply that we actually had one of our friends play it who never plays Magic. So he was able to pilot the deck successfully, and actually he was one of the biggest threats on the table. It has a straightforward strategy that we've seen before, tokens, and it's a fun strategy for new players. I do think this is the best deck for any new player. What is interesting about this deck, statistically speaking, is that it actually ramped the least. Now, I don't know if that's because of variance, just our games, they didn't have a chance to ramp, or it's because this deck was always posing a threat, so maybe the person was getting eliminated first and therefore it ramped the least.
It was posing a threat most of the games. When you have like big creatures, around by turn 5 and 8, yeah, everyone was kind of focused on that player.
Yeah, and that could very well be why it didn't ramp as well, because it does have ramp spells. I did count the number of ramp spells in it, and it made sense. I wouldn't add any anymore, so that could be an outlier. But no, this deck played exactly how you would think it would go. Any other thoughts?
Just one thought. I know that on Commander Cast, it seems a little low, but that's only the reason. The only reason why that is so low, it's because the commander stuck around on the field the most, either because no one had a board wipe or some sort of target removal. So once it was on the board, it did its job to make enough tokens to make a threatening board state for your opponents.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, being a 2/5, it's not exactly something to get easy to get rid of. And sometimes people would cut deals like, let me attack you, you can block, they can bounce off each other, and the Primal Genesis player would still get a token. So totally agree. So the next deck up is Merciless Rage, the Rakdos Madness deck. A caveat for this deck, we did not count Angie's Madness ability as card draw because it required discarding card. Therefore, you're not getting any advantage. You're getting more so card selection versus card draw. So what'd you think about this one?
I was kind of interested to playing this deck because I think Rakdos, in my personal opinion, has gotten a bad rap for a long time just because it's kind of, it starts off strong, but kind of doesn't know how to finish out games very well. But overall, I was very surprised. It kept its ground most games.
So this deck required the least setup, and that makes a lot of sense given Angie's ability. It's also easier to cast Angie multiple times due to the CMC of the card. So it worked fast and it worked well. And you want those in a Rakdos deck like this, an aggro deck, you want it to be quick. What actually surprised me about this deck was it had a lot more recursion than I initially suspected. It ran to me almost a little bit like a Golgari deck or a graveyard recursion deck, where you just want to put stuff in your bin with the madness and then get it out or cheat it out more accurately later on. And I thought that was really good, and I think that made it powerful because I don't think madness enough is good. I think you need to pair it with recursion.
Yeah, I've also heard people state that this is the most competitive deck out of all the commander decks this year, and I have to agree that it is kind of competitive. It starts off strong, when you have a handful of like madness abilities that you can cast for very cheap in the beginning of the game, and and also throwing stuff in your graveyard to get it back later helps a lot because it's having like two hands, it's one that's just you'll use for later on.
No, yeah, totally agree with everything you're saying. It's just the quickest deck, and it's easier to get going. So 100%. All right, so the next deck up is Monistic Intellect. We saved the worst for last, I guess. In case that's a preview of what we're gonna say. It's the Jeskai flashback deck. An important note for this deck, we probably swapped commanders the most for this deck. Between the Wall and Elsha, there were just better options. In the Wall's case, a more fun option.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So what'd you think about this one?
I don't have a lot of nice things to say about it. I honestly think in my opinion, I think it's one of the weaker decks that you can get. But I also think there's a lot of room to work with. First of all, there's not enough flashback, in my opinion. I also think that the spells to cast, there needs to be. I know they did put a good amount of they put a small amount to reduce the cost, but it's like when you're stuck in a game and it's turn 5 and you can't cast anything either because you don't have the lands, or your hand is just, this cost is over 6 mana with these spells. And not to say they're bad spells, they're great spells, but it's one of those things where it works. This deck works better on in the later game. but in the beginning of the game, you're going to get hit a couple of times.
Yeah, so there's just a couple things going that are happening straight out of the box with this deck. It is the weakest of the four, statistically speaking, from our experiment. It led in only one category, which is reactivity, and it barely led in reactivity. To me, playing the deck, I think the worst part of it is the CMC cost of flashback. If you have a spell that costs for 5 as a sorcery in your graveyard as a flashback spell, it's going to cost like 8 or 9. Then Savine herself or himself, I don't know, costs 5 mana, 2 colorless and Jeskai. And it only triggers when you cast a flashback spell. So you're talking about like 9 to 11 mana, and the best case scenario, what you're doing is you're copying a flashback spell. To me, that's not great. I would have made Savine say, hey, flashback spells cost 3 less from your guard, or better yet, spells in your graveyard cost 3 less, and then every time you play a spell from your graveyard, draw a card. That would have been a lot better than what it is now.
I would agree.
I will say, though, I did play with this deck as Elsha, and Elsha worked a lot better just as like a Spells Matters deck, because Elsha allows you to play at flash speed the top card of your library. So it gives you basically an extra card, and it lets you look at that card at any time. And I thought it just worked a lot better. Elsha also has a minor note as a prowess trigger.
Yeah, I definitely do agree with that. I think that Elsha should have been the face commander of this deck, but it's one of those things where I guess they felt that maybe the flashback would be more fun. But yeah, I think they should have gone. I know they've gone with sort of a theme, like with all the decks, but it's one of those things where you do a universal theme. I think it would also help, like cards in your graveyard would cost less, like you said, or something like that. Sticking to just one thing like flashback or this or that. But they did a decent job on this one. I just think they kind of like slipped on this last deck.
Yeah, I do think that the flashback theme would have worked if you made a mana reduction and card draw based off that. I do like the theme they chose, actually, so I guess I slightly disagree there. I just think they executed it poorly with the commander they chose. Like, every other commander feeds more into the strategy easier. Like, it takes a lot less work for them to feed into the strategy. For example, the Sultai Morph commander lets you play morphs for free, then draw cards. Like, that works. That's an engine on the card itself, right? And that's kind of what you wanted from this commander, but it just wasn't an engine. It just was extra value, like copy a sorcery from your graveyard. Well, if you have 9 mana and you're copying a flashback spell, you should be winning the game at that point, and you're just usually not. They also should have made more flashback spells, in my opinion, for commander that were like commander specific, that could actually maybe take an extra turn or something, like do something powerful. And I just don't think it was there. I think this is more disjointed than the other 3 decks.
Yeah, I definitely do agree that they should have included a lot more flashback spells. They kind of, but not nowhere near enough. But they usually make these decks with the intent that, okay, it's up to the player to upgrade or to use. But I also will add this one little note: if you're ever gonna play with the wall commander out of the deck, expect the games to be long. Brings out all the games because everyone doesn't want to attack each other, and when people do attack each other, it's like it's fun, but expect things to go, take a while.
Oh, for sure. 100% agree on that. So let's talk about our favorite non-commander cards from the set. So the first one I want to talk about is Leadership Backing, which casts for 2 and a blue. It's an instant, and it's actually in multiple decks. Target player returns each commander they control from the battlefield to the command zone draw card. I love this card. This is exactly exactly a good example of good design around a particular set. So this obviously only works in commander. It's a way to remove a commander, so it's like a swords for a commander, but it's a bounce effect, and it goes back to the command zone. So it is like an exile almost effect. And it replaces itself because it draws a card, so at 3 CMC instant speed, like, this is perfect. This is exactly what I want to be doing. The next card I kind of chose was from the Sultai Morph Faceless Menace deck. It's a 5 colorless and 2 swamps for a creature, Ape Snake. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, manifest the top card of that player's library. Put it down on the battlefield under your control as a 2/2 creature. Whenever a creature you control own but you don't own dies, its owner loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So obviously in the morph deck it fits beautifully. You want face down creatures, but this actually would work in any deck because think about it. It's removal. You're removing the top card of your player's library, your opponent's library rather. And then if you can sack those creatures or use them as blockers, your opponents lose life. So it could go in like an aristocrat's deck, for example. I just think it has a lot more utility. And also you can cast those manifest creatures at some point if you choose to do so. So I do think it's a very unique card. So the last card I chose was also from the Sultai Morph deck. It's a sorcery, cast for also 5 colorless and 2 black. Exile all creature cards from target player's graveyard in a face-down pile. Shuffle that pile, then manifest those cards. Again, this card would work best in like a morph deck where you have face-down creatures. But to me, it reminds me a little bit of like Yawgmoth's Will, where you're getting all that value from a graveyard, or Beyond the Graves, which it's just a card that could win you the game on the spot depending on what's in that player's graveyard. I like this design a lot.
So my favorite cards out of the Commander set was Doomed Artist. Every time, you cast Doom Artist in the beginning of the game, if you let him sit there, he's going to become very problematic when he leaves. So Doom Artist is a 2 mana with 1 and 1 white mana. He's a creature human artificer. Sculptures you control cannot attack or block. At the beginning of your end step, create a colorless sculpture artifact creature token. With this creature's power and toughness is equal to the number of sculptures you control. So right off the bat, you want your Doomed Artist to stay on the field as possible, at least 5 turns to get its value worth, and then you just want to sack him or have him die, and then you have 5/5s running around, punching people in the face, and if you get if he's on the field for any longer. Yeah, your opponent better have a board wipe because it's just you're just gonna have a great day and your opponents are gonna have a terrible day. The next card that I also like just because I'm a green player is Road of Return. It's a green, so sorcery. Choose 1. Return target permanent card from your graveyard or to your hand. The second mode is put your commander into your hand from the command zone, and also has Entwine. Pay 2. You choose 2, or if you play the Entwine, you pay the Entwine costs. So overall, it's like paying 4 altogether, 2 green and 2 generic to not only get a card back, but to get your commander from your command zone to your hand. I think that's just a great valued card. So my last favorite card is Sanctum of Eternity. It's a land, and you add 1 generic mana. You can tap it, or you can pay 2, tap it, return your commander from your battlefield to your hand, and activate this ability only during your turn. So I personally, it's not Command Beacon, but it generally can do the same thing every turn if you want to. If your commander has an EBT effect or something like that, or if your opponent just says, hey, have to exile your commander, it's like, well, nope, I'm gonna get my commander back. So it's you can basically just abuse it, and you don't have to sack it. So that's the one thing I really do like about it overall. It's like you can just keep on going it and keep on doing it, and if your opponent doesn't have an answer to get rid of that land, as long as you have 2 mana, your commander can always be safe during your turn.
All right, so now let's look at all 4 decks together. As you can see here, like we said earlier as well, the Faceless Menace Sultai Morph deck won the most by a game. It also ramped the most, and it was had the second most card draw, so you can kind of see why it won the most. Mystic Intellect actually had the most card draw, but that's the only category it really led in. In terms of setup, recovery rate, and number of times cast commander, Merciless Rage won in all of those. Remember, for setup and recovery rate, you want the lowest number possible. You want to set up in the least number of turns, and you want to recover in the least amount of turns. Reactivity, Mystic Intellect won by a very, very slight margin. In fact, I would hate to even call in. But you can see across the board, it did the worst in most of the other categories, which kind of fits into what we experienced when we were playing the decks. So what do you think of all 4 of them?
I personally liked all of them. But I will say Mystic Intellect is the weakest one, in my opinion. It's just because I don't think it's very beginner player friendly as much, as well as I think it's missing a few key things to really make it, great out of the box. Primal Genesis was the most friendly out of the decks. It's, you want to make tokens, go big, you can go big, you can go tall, you can go wide, it does a lot what you want. And, it's really focused on that. My only problem with it so far, for some reason, it obviously had a ramp problem for some reason. Why? Because it's in green. But that was the statistics and our data that we gathered.
Yeah, so like we talked about, that could be variance.
Yeah.
Every commander game's different, and also when you're the biggest threat on the board, as this deck was, maybe they're getting eliminated first, and that could be it because our ramp lands at the end of the game. So
yeah, reactivity was pretty much next to nothing. It wasn't. It didn't have a lot, but that was fine because it just focused on what it wanted to do: make tokens, go wide, go tall. Faceless Menace. I was very surprised because I thought, I didn't think they can improve on the morph mechanic or make it better. But like you said before, Animar was the most popular for it, commander choice, but they did a really decent job. I mean, you're casting morph for free, you're drawing cards, and you're building resources at the beginning of the game pretty fast.
I will totally agree with what you just said there. I do think it's the most unique deck, even though we had Animar Morph and EDH before. It wasn't, Animar's never built for Morph. It just happened to work with Morph because it makes your Morphs cost one colorless less. This one's actually designed for Morph. You play your Morph for free. You draw a card every time you play a Morph. Like, it's the most unique. Appreciate that. I do like Primal Genesis as well, but for me, tokens have been a thing in EDH forever, so I do appreciate branching off into a new direction with the Morph deck. And also the Madness deck, too. I do think that was a little bit of a different direction to take a recursion deck in.
Yeah, I mean, Madness overall, it's a very odd mechanic in EDH because it usually does one thing only, but it's the commander just really, really fast out of the box. Casting your, it's actually, cast your commander the most because it costs so cheap. It's only 3 mana altogether, and you're just doing what you want before, around turn 5. You're tossing cards in the graveyard, or you're, recurring something after that. But overall, I think it is the most competitive out of, but it was fairly great for, something colors I'm never playing in. It was Rakdos.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with that. It was definitely the fastest deck by our measurements, like our statistics, and not just how it felt. So we can back that up with what we measured. And I will say this as a final thought on all 4 decks from me, is that they all played well. They all have value. They'll have good. Most of them have good reprints. Obviously, Mystic Intellect was a little disappointing, but I do think that when they played against each other, other than Mystic Intellect, they were all balanced against each other. Like, I don't think any one deck dominated, and you can kind of see that in our statistics. You can kind of see that they're around the same areas.
There was no breed lethality problem this year.
Yeah, that's right. There wasn't a deck that just. So, guys, that's what we had today for C19. I hope you liked our little different statistical take on the decks. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell.
And thanks as always. Thank you for joining us. All right. See you guys next time.